World War I is another example in which we're seeing the definitions and boundaries of American citizenship transform during this time. So these are two advertising posters encouraging the enlistment of black officers and black soldiers for the war cause. As we see, the reality of black soldiers fighting in World War II is starkly different from the images that we see in these depictions. But for the most part, we're going to be covering this lecture, this era of intervention, as a kind of climax of this era of imperialism. So essentially, when we're talking about World War I, we're talking about the fighting of imperialistic powers, fighting over colonies and fighting over world dominance. So they're primarily European powers, and America is interjecting itself as another world power into this competition of imperialistic powers. So this first aspect of the lecture is going to be talking about this era of intervention, the way in which America eventually intervenes in these European powers competing with each other. And then we'll talk about a little bit about America's foreign policy stance with regard to those other European powers, and the way in which the primary stance of neutrality is overwhelmingly overturned by a series of incidences. And then finally, we'll get into the domestic impact of the World War I on American society. But before we begin, we have to get a better conception of what we mean by this consolidation of global power within the hands of a very small ruling class in Europe broadly. So, and this is best crystallized in the form of the Saxe-Coburg dynasty, essentially. Three ruling families, well, one ruling family controlling three different countries throughout Europe. So you have King George V, who is king of England from 1865 to 1937. His cousin Nicholas II, who is Tsar of Russia for about that same time. Tsar of Russia is ultimately assassinated during the Russian Revolution. And then finally, cousin Wilhelm II, who is Kaiser or King of Germany during this time. And so this is all one family that have a controlling share of European interests during this. So World War I has many underlying factors and causes, but primarily the catalyst which leads to war is the assassination of an heir of the Habsburg Empire. In June 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this murder set in motion a series of events that plunged Europe into the most devastating war the world had ever seen. So in the years before 1914, European nations had engaged in a scramble to obtain a colonial possession. In the aftermath of the assassination, the major powers of Eastern Europe declared war on Serbia. So within little more than a month, because of the European powers' interlocking military and trade alliances, Britain, France, Russia, and Japan formed an alliance against the Central European powers of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. When war broke out in 1914, President Wilson, who we covered in last lecture, proclaimed American neutrality. Right from the beginning, the United States declares this position of neutrality, which President Wilson is very firm on. However, over time, we'll see that stance of neutrality ultimately ebbs. Part of the tactics of the German Navy was submarine warfare against ships entering and leaving British ports. So part of the tactic that Germany employs from the beginning is to attack British merchant vessels. Okay, so in May 1915, a German submarine sank the British liner Lusitania, which was actually carrying a large cache of arms for the Allied forces. So the Lusitania sank off the coast of Ireland, causing the deaths of 1,198 passengers, including 124 American citizens during this time. And even this did not sway Woodrow Wilson's official stance of neutrality. He says he reaffirms his position in 1914, directly after the sinking of Lusitania, that America will remain neutral in fact as well as in name, impartial in thought as well as in action. So even though America had developed these very close ties with the Allied powers, specifically Britain, via trade and finance, the two countries were united with their business communities primarily. The United States was not yet willing to engage militarily in and intervene on. Continuously, however, after 1914, U-boats, these German submarines, continued to attack British merchant vessels, and then continually started to attack American merchant vessels for the same reasons that we were targeting the British merchant vessels, primarily that because American merchant vessels were smuggling weapons and armaments and supplies for the Allied war effort. So in March 1916, another German U-boat submarine sank a Sussex, an unarmed French ship, and injured, again, several Americans. Again, Woodrow Wilson was not willing to change his position of neutrality. By March 21st, 1917, German boats had sunk at least 6 American ships. And at that point, by 1917, Woodrow Wilson issues an ultimatum. He says, if Germany did not restrict its U-boat attacks on U.S. and other Allied merchant vessels, those unarmed merchant vessels, then the U.S. would sever diplomatic negotiations. And with any kind of military conflict, the first step before military conflict is the severing of diplomatic negotiations. So this is ultimately a threat. America's stance on neutrality was ultimately overturned by a military negotiation between German government and diplomats in Mexico, in which essentially Germany was appealing to the Mexican war effort in order to boost its presence in the Caribbean. And so in return, after the war, if Germany won, they would return part of the lands that America had essentially conquered from the Mexican Empire. So in March 1917, British spies intercepted and made public the Zimmerman telegram. So Arthur Zimmerman is the German diplomat working in Mexico at this time, negotiating with the Mexican government and brokering this relationship with Germany. So the Zimmerman telegram was a message by Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmerman calling on Mexico to join the coming war against the United States and promising to help recover territory it lost in the Mexican War in 1846. On April 2nd, Wilson went before Congress after hearing this message and hearing about this message in newspapers throughout the world. And he asks Congress for a declaration of war, breaking America's neutrality stance. Okay? The world, he proclaimed, must be made safe for democracy. So he's invoking democracy in this claim to go to war. The world, he proclaimed, must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. The war resolution passed Senate in a vote 82-6, which is an overwhelming vote, and America enters war against Germany. From the beginning, America's first form of intervention was specifically in attacking the U-boats that had been attacking, and the U.S. Navy quickly neutralized the U-boat threat by 1918, and the U.S. military then committed troops to on-land war. Some of the first soldiers to fight some of the first U.S. soldiers to fight in World War I actually fought not in U.S. military uniforms, but rather French military uniforms. And these are the Harlem Hellfighters. So the Harlem Hellfighters are kind of like the Black Buffalo Soldiers, a black-only regiment. At this time, Jim Crow segregation had structured these black regiments. At this time, Jim Crow policies had segregated American military personnel and creating these black-only regiments. So the 369th Infantry Regiment was of the New York Army National Guard, and it served in World War I and up until World War II. So they're mostly comprised of African Americans, but also include a number of Puerto Rican Americans. So it's a non-white military unit. And as I said, they don't fight initially under the American flag, but rather were contracted out to the French military forces as a kind of mercenary force So it's interesting to see that even though these campaign posters saying the colored man is no slacker, they are the true sons of liberty, they are not able, because of Jim Crow policies, they're not able to fight under the American flag or even in American uniforms, but rather are contracted out to the front lines of the French forces. So during World War I, the Harlem Hellfighters spent nearly 191 days on the front line trenches, more than any other American unit. They also suffered the most losses of any American regiment, with 1,500 casualties. So this kind of illustrates the kind of false promise of liberty in America after the Civil War and the way in which it's manifest during wartime, World War I. Now we're going to transition to some of the domestic impacts of World War I, primarily in the form of repression of civil liberties. So there are a number of things that come out of America's involvement with World War I, primarily things like daylight savings times. And this is a federal policy put in place of setting clocks ahead by 1 hour to provide more daylight for manufacturing enterprises to produce war materials. Similarly, the National War Labor Board is essentially a federal agreement that streamlines collective bargaining, but also is implemented to resolve labor disputes. Herbert Hoover, who was later President of the United States, makes an appearance here as well. Wilson appoints him as food administrator to regulate rations. He later then serves as a Secretary of Commerce, and then finally as President in the late 1920s and early 1930s. But during World War I, Herbert Hoover is responsible for rationing food supplies in the United States by creating things like meatless Wednesdays, so that people will sacrifice their meat consumption and give it to the military. Same thing with wheatless Wednesdays, things like this, to provide more supplies for the war effort. He's also responsible for popularizing these things called war gardens, which are essentially initiatives to get people to grow their own vegetables rather than taking from markets which would be allocated to the war effort. Aside from these aspects that come out of the domestic impact of the World War I, there are two congressional acts, which really impinge civil rights in the United States. First, there's the Espionage Act, which essentially mandates severe penalties for anyone found guilty of interfering with the draft or encouraging disloyalty in the United States. So this concept of disloyalty is quite ambiguous here. Anyone that seems to be going against the wishes of the government can be deemed disloyal, and we're going to see this again in the 1950s during this era of anti-communism, where anyone that seems to be even remotely favorable to communist sympathies is deemed an enemy of the state. And we see this starkly during World War I, when numerous political activists, from Emma Goldman to Eugene Debs, are highlighted as enemies of the state and are summarily jailed for So Eugene Debs is an interesting case because he is jailed for leading strikes and protests during this time and is arrested. But still continues his political campaign from within prison. So here you have in 1920 Eugene Debs for president in his convict number below. So this is an example of the way in which the federal government is using its power to repress civil liberties. And the same thing with the Sedition Act. So the Sedition Act, which is really implemented in tandem with the Espionage Act, is essentially extends penalties to anyone deemed to have abused the government in writing. So if you're writing and criticizing the government in any way, you can fall guilty under the Sedition Act. And so 1,500 people were arrested for violating the Espionage Act. Again, Eugene Debs was convicted guilty for this. In addition to that, 400 periodicals, 400 newspapers and journals were banned, including the New York Times. And so what we see under the Sedition and the Espionage Act is this regime of surveillance, censorship, and censorship and seizure of mail, which kind of consolidates the power of the established ruling class in the United States. After years of arduous fighting, even before the United States entered the war, the World War I is ultimately resolved with the Armistice of 1918. So in October 1918, the European powers, the fighting imperialistic powers, reach an armistice, a peace, as it were. So after nearly 9 million soldiers died, they finally make peace. The overwhelming majority of casualties suffered during the war are from Germany. Nearly 9 million soldiers died during World War I. Germany suffers 1.8 million casualties. Russia is close to that, suffers 1.7 million casualties. France suffers 1.4 million. America, by comparison, only loses about 126,000 casualties, but nonetheless is a high cost to pay for imperialistic conflict. In January 1919, a conference is held at the Palace of Versailles among representatives of the competing imperialistic powers, including Britain, France, and Italy. Germany, however, was excluded. Some of the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles are that it imposed harsh conditions, harsh terms of economic reparations on the German country. Germany surrenders all of its colonies. Again, keep in mind this is an imperialistic conflict here. And Germany is deprived of its navy, its merchant marine force, and its army, essentially leaving it defenseless against opposing European powers. Okay. One of the lasting impacts of the armistice, however, is a speech that Woodrow Wilson gives during this conference. So he establishes what he calls a new international world order through a speech called the 14 Points, in which he's outlining an agreement among imperialistic powers in which there will be no secret treaties, for example, freedom of the seas. So people traveling through the seas, that's neutral territory. That if anyone violates that freedom, they are subject to war according to these points. There's a reduction in trade barriers. So he sees by enhancing trade is a way of reducing military conflict, reduction of armaments, and the start of decolonization. Ultimately, what happens as a consequence of the Armistice of 1918 is that Woodrow Wilson proposes a League of Nations, which is kind of a proto-form of the UN, the United Nations. So the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson conceives of the League of Nations as a general association of nations, he says, that could afford mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. So this is a kind of convening agreement among imperialistic powers that will adjudicate among themselves disputes that may arise concerning their colonial territories. So in the aftermath of World War I, we see a starkly different political landscape in Central Europe, at least. So this is Europe in 1914, where you see the Allied powers featured in green here, the Central powers featured in light in pink. So, however, after that, we see a completely different landscape that's reflected in the international New World Order that Woodrow Wilson envisions, in which you have a series of new nations carved out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but also we have the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire as well, and the colonial territorial holdings that entailed as well. World War I was so devastating for so many people that it ignites a whole artistic movement, which kind of gives expression to the trauma of war. And I think that's really exhibited by German painter, surrealist painter Otto Dix. Here you see the scat card players painting with invalids from 1920, which kind of illustrates the aftermath, at least in terms of the human devastation of the people that fought in the war. Throughout all of these images that he paints in the aftermath of World War I, we see primarily veterans of war who are disfigured for life. But I think this is representative of a broader trauma that the Western powers experience, because it's one of the most costly wars in human history that has devastating impacts economically, but also in terms of the human cost. Keep in mind, 9 million people, soldiers, died during this war, and that does not even account for the non-combatant fatalities during this time. Touching more on the domestic impact of the war, we see a massive migration of African Americans from rural America to the major metropolitan industrializing eras in the United States. And this migration primarily takes place during the time in which America is negotiating war and ultimately engaging in war. World War I unleashes a series of social changes that alter the contours of American race relations, and that's primarily exhibited in the Great Migration from 1900 to 1920. So the combination of increased wartime production created more jobs, which drew African Americans. But once the combination of increased wartime production and the drastic fall off in immigration from Europe once war broke out opened thousands of industrial jobs that African Americans took advantage of by traveling to these northern cities. With any migration of people, there's always push and pull factors. What I mean by that is there are factors that pull people to a certain location, and there are factors that push people away from their residence, okay, from their origins, okay. In terms of the Great Migration, some of the pull factors are higher wages in northern factories, also opportunities for educating your children, and also the prospect of exercising voting rights outside of Jim Crow South. These are all pull factors for African Americans, not to mention owning your own land in northern cities or in northern suburbs. These are all pull factors, pulling these African Americans from the rural South to the urban North. Some of the push factors, however, the primary push factor here is this explosion of lynching that takes place in the early 20th century. T. Arnold Hill, one of the leading civil rights advocates during this time, once said that every time a lynching takes place in a community down south, colored people will arrive in Chicago within 2 weeks, which kind of gives us some sense of, some of the motivating factors that are pushing African Americans out of the rural South. So the black migrants, mostly young men and women, carried with them a vision of opportunity, of social and economic freedom. Okay, and this mindset became known as the quote-unquote new Negro identity. So it became a new mindset of prospects, of freedom, independence that these migrants would find in the North. Obviously, many of these prospects became unrealized, but there is a degree of freedom that these migrants did experience. And we can see some of the prospects realized in the form of the Harlem Renaissance. So the Harlem Renaissance is this period of time in Harlem where there is an efflorescence of black culture, which is riding on the coattails of this new Negro identity. A historian once said, a spirit was in the air of hope, progress, possibilities, which proved particularly alluring to the young men and unmarried. Harlem streets soon filled with their music, their voices, their laughter. During this 20-year era, we see an explosion of black culture, which continues to influence American popular culture today. So in the form of music, new forms of music, specifically jazz coming out of New Orleans, new styles of poetry, new styles of visual arts as well. The center of a lot of this activity was primarily in a tradition that was carried from black rural South, but was given new life in the North. And this is what's known as the Rent Party. So the Rent Party definitely has a long history in the black rural South. However, in Harlem, it takes on new life. So the Rent Party is essentially a house party, and today's house party draws from a lot of this tradition, whether we know it or not. So the Rent Party is both a center of cultural exploration and creativity, but it's also a kind of economic imperative, social imperative for these black migrants in Harlem. So the Rent Party works like this. A rent party is founded by essentially holding a party in your apartment, and talented musicians, for example, Bessie Smith, or Cab Calloway would come to your apartment just because it's such a local environment and perform for an audience. And people would pay a modest entrance fee, and that entrance fee would go towards raising rent for that family for that particular week. And it's very central to the cultural explosion that takes place in the Harlem Renaissance. So in addition to an explosion of cultural activity, we also see the proliferation of non-binary gender and sexuality categories. So throughout this era, black lesbians and gay men were meeting each other pretty freely during this time on street corners, socializing in cabarets, also cavorting in rent parties, and worshiping on church on Sundays. And they created the language and social structure, and they created the networks and institutions that carry on through the 20th century. The Harlem gay subculture quickly declined, however, after the stock market crash in 1921, which really put a damper on the rent party scene. But nonetheless, these institutions carried on even past that time. So it's also important to know that during this era of the Harlem Renaissance, we also see a boom of black activism during this time. This is when Marcus Garvey, we covered him last lecture, becomes a very prominent civil rights figure working within Harlem. Same thing with W.E.B. Du Bois. Also, this is the period of time in which he's emerging as well. So in a way, the promises and the visions of freedoms that black migrants, we also have to keep in mind that this is the social and cultural milieu out of which people like James Baldwin, formative literary figures of the 20th century, emerge. And there's quite a number of details in which James Baldwin is recounting his youth during the Harlem Renaissance, attending rent parties and taking part in all of the cultural activities that are rooted in the Harlem Renaissance. So some of the key terms for this lecture are, again, what is the Great Migration? Who are the Harlem Hellfighters? What is the Harlem Renaissance? What is a rent party? How does it work? What are the imperatives of the rent party? The Zimmerman telegram. How does that get us into World War I? What is this concept of the new Negro? The Lusitania, League of Nations, Espionage Act, and the domestic impact on civil liberties during World War I. And then finally, Eugene Debs.